Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Richard Presents Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, a tutorial. Over the course of this video, I will be going over character creation, how to play Dungeons & Dragons, expectations at the table, and answering any questions or comments that come into chat. My co-host Jared will be here to fill in any missing information I may catch, or read any questions or ask any of their own. So, for those following along at home, I recommend you go to dndbeyond.com and pull up a link in front of you and make an account. The account is free. You could sign in with Google if you're feeling particularly lazy. And this will allow you to no longer have to buy the basic kits for the game. For 5th edition,
You can also sign it with Twitch, by the way.
And you can sign in with Twitch as well. Thank you. And feel free to let me know if I'm going a little too fast. Tempo is a work in progress for me. So, first, for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, there's tons of things you can spend money on, but the basic rules, the standard rules document, is completely free online. And the tutorial I'm planning to give today is under the assumption that you don't want to spend any money, because we're in college, therefore are poor. The reason I use D&D Beyond for my online handling is not only does it let you build an online sheet that your other players can use to interact with and you can run a game fully through D&D Beyond, but you can also print the physical sheet off. So when the world returns to a less apocalyptic setting, it becomes completely reasonable to sit down with your printed sheet and play in person while still using D&D Beyond. I'm just admitting another latecomer to the chat.
Okay.
Welcome to Richard Presents How to Play Dungeons & Dragons. All you've missed is a brief rundown of the website. And effectively, we're going through dndbeyond.com. So if you would like to click the link and make an account, that's all it'll take to catch up to the lecture so far. And as always, feel free to ask any questions in the chat or unmute yourself if you have a direct question. And I am recording this for the purposes of sharing it with people later. If that's good, please give me a thumbs up in the chat. Excellent. So far, if you have D&D Beyond in front of you, I can start walking through. If you're still making the account, that's fine. Just let me know and I'll roll back whenever possible. But first, a super brief explanation of why we're doing a character first, and then I'm going to kind of explain the rules as it goes. So Dungeons & Dragons is built on 3 key components: roleplay, combat, and exploration. Unlike a lot of more structured video games and things, Dungeons & Dragons have as a dungeon master that allows things to be improvised on the fly. And as we go over the sheet and the abilities your character has, you'll learn that your sheet's more of a guideline. And the real core of the game is bartering between yourself, your other players, and the dungeon master to tell engaging, interactive multiplayer stories, working together to solve puzzles, and creating such long-running jokes that they can last a lifetime. All right, so let's begin with the character creation. First, you click Create a Character. Here there's a couple options, but we're just going to go through standard, a nice step-by-step approach. They have some optional help text, but I'm pretty much here to replace that. So on your first page, there's a section that says Character Name. You can leave that blank for now, or you can click Random. I usually name the character after the fact, because various steps of the process might shift how it goes. Next are these little boxes called sources. For our purposes, we don't need any of these on. To give a quick summary, if you buy extra books from different settings and things, you can turn them on. But the characters we're going to be creating today are what are known as Adventure League or legal characters. They're characters you could play at any local game shop, any tournament or league, any convention, and they don't break any of the rules. A lot of dungeon masters will let you make custom things, or you can discuss using rules from outside the game, third party, make your own classes. But for the purposes of this, we're going to try and use something standardized, so that way, say you make a character today and end up playing in someone else's game next week, there won't be any issues. So the next checkbox is dice rolling. That allows us to use these sheets alone to play online. Well, it works best when paired with a voice chat of some sort, so we're going to leave that checkbox. The rest of these boxes we can pretty much leave alone. And with that, we're going to move on to the next tab here. So first, you choose your fantasy race. As you can see from the list, because I have been slowly acquiring D&D books over the last 4 years, you hit a situation known as choice paralysis, where there's simply too many options. So, for today's lecture, we're just going to put it onto basic rules. There's enough options in basic rules you can make a truly unique original character without having to go into the minutiae of too many specifics. So, for the character we're making together today, does chat have any suggestions on the race? So for your character race, each character on D&D Beyond, when you click them, will not only give you their stats and effects, but more importantly, will give you some descriptions about the race itself. For example, we have Dragonborn, and if you want to take the time to read it, it'll give you a bit of their history, where they're from, character name suggestions, and you can spend a lot of time learning the specifics of your character's race. But because D&D is a game about role-playing and improvisation, if you pick a dragon person and your dragon person, you've decided that they're from Narnia. You have decided my dragon person is from Narnia. Most dungeon masters aren't going to deny you that freedom. They might work with you to be like, well, Narnia is not a thing in the game. How about this Narnia-like place? And you'll end up with a middle ground. So for picking your race at the start, you can start looking into specific stats and things, but I recommend go through your heart. Think about some of your favorite fantasy movies and various TV tropes, and just pick something you think would be fun to play. So, since pretty much everybody on the planet has mentioned Lord of the Rings as one of their books they've read, and I've also seen a lot of comments about people's love of the Hunger Games in this class, I think for their first character making in this tutorial, let's just go with a basic human for now. So humans come in two varieties, basic and variant. Basic humans just get 1 to every stat. They're the simplest thing, the least thought has to go into it. Variant human's a full other thing I may explain later, but for now we're just going to pick basic human. So after you've picked your race, it'll tell you which stats it gives to your race. For stats, which we're going to go over to right now, they not only determine how you play the game, but also the type of character you make and how you play your character. So, for choosing your stats, there's 3 options. There's standard array, where they give you a list of numbers, and you put the numbers in each box. There's point buy, where they use a system to pretty much tell you you're pretty much purchasing your stats. In older versions of the game, players would roll for stats, which is a process involving rolling 4 6-sided dice and picking the best 3. I personally do not use those for my games, and they're not typically used for convention play. They're just kind of a holdover from an older version of the game. So I'm going to pick standard here, and let me know in the chat if I'm going too fast about anything. Just pausing for a moment to see if any comments are coming in. Everyone happy? So far, so good? All right. So the reason I'm starting with stats is because they determine not only how your character plays, but how they act. So we'll start with the most basic, strength. Strength does 4 things, really, and it does probably the least amount of things out of every stat in the game. It's how hard you hit people with most melee weapons, how well you climb and jump and swim, how well you grapple people, and how hard you throw people. So, for strength, from an acting point of view, If you want to build a strong character, you think, oh, I'm going to build like your meathead jock or your military commando or your grim dark anti-hero or your baker in the Hunger Games who needs to throw a bag of flour over their head. They're going to be strength based. So for the character we're building today, one of our first decisions if we want to be strength, dexterity, or balanced. Strength is melee, how hard you hit things. Dexterity is evasion, hiding, pickpocketing, and general sneakiness. So I'm just going to put dexterity high for now, and strength at medium. The next one is constitution, how durable your character is. You don't really use it for skills so much as it determines how many hit points you have, how long you can stay in a fight, and various survivabilities. As a general rule, you kind of want to give yourself as much constitution as you really have room for. Next, we get to those three are the three hard stats. The physical stats, they're pretty straightforward. Next, we're going into the more intellectual stats, which can be a little more confusing, but are used for a fair number of classes of characters. First is intelligence. Intelligence in the context of Dungeons and Dragons is book smarts. It's things like history, religious studies, spells, what animals live in this area, very specific bits of knowledge. So if you want to build and play, say, a Sherlock Holmes type character, a House MD, what have you, they'd be a high intelligence character. The next stat is wisdom, and that's more your street smarts. Your ability to perceive things, notice things, pick up on things. And that's like your Uncle Irohs from Avatar, your wise old man characters. Also, medical and first aid fall under wisdom as well. Lastly, we have charisma. Charisma is how good you are at talking to people. Your ability to persuade, to deceive, to intimidate, and to perform. Just because you lack social skills in real life doesn't mean your character will lack them in the game. So now that we know kind of what all the stats are, I'm going to give a quick summary. Strength is how hard you can throw a tomato. Dexterity, can you dodge a tomato being thrown at you? Constitution, can you eat a bad tomato? Intelligence, do you know that a tomato is a fruit? Wisdom, do you know to treat it like a vegetable? Charisma, can you sell somebody a tomato-based fruit salad? So now that we kind of have an idea what our abilities are, everything else we do follows past that. So we're going to go into classes. Classes, if you've ever played a video game, you've kind of got a decent idea what the various classes are, but I'm going to give a relatively quick summary of them. So first we have Artificer. It's an extra class they added into the game later. Never play it, don't pick it, it's nothing for darkness. So the first real class is going to be Barbarian. Barbarian is your Conan the Barbarians, your Savage Warriors. They don't have to wear heavy armor. They enter a rage. They have a ton of hit points. And they're the kind of character that lets you run in, axes in both hands, screaming at your enemy. But just because there's tropes about barbarians doesn't mean you have to play them that way. Are you the quiet, timid person that breaks into bursts of rage like the Hulk? Are you an angry berserker like Conan the Barbarian? Or something completely your own? Perhaps your character is a door-to-door salesman who just snapped one day. Either way, barbarians are one of the easier classes to use, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the less complex your character is, the more time you have to think about how you want to do it. A wizard may cast a fireball, and they'll look at their list of spells, pick the spell that's appropriate. Because a barbarian is pretty much most likely to run up and hit somebody, you can think about the flare. You're not just going to run up and hit. You're going to say, my character chooses to run up, kick off the rocks, and bring down the might of his axe on his foe. Or I'm going to grab them by the face, hold them over my head, and drop Batman on my knee. That is the barbarian. Next on our list is the bard. The bard is your musician. They're a spellcaster who focuses on helping your friends, inspiring, talking their way out of trouble. They're your Neil Patrick Harris. They're your the Beatles stage musician who's also an adventurer. So if you're playing a bard, you'd be focusing on making like a dexterous, charismatic character. Next on the list is your cleric. Your cleric is your religious doctor. They're wisdom based. They're able to tell if someone's lying, able to hear if there's a trap in the next room, bandage somebody's wounds, give them first aid. And right below the cleric, which is exactly. So I've seen some clerics be exactly that, the mom friend, cleric of light and healing. And I saw another person make a cleric of beauty, whose objective it was to effectively use the power of makeup and bedazzling to conquer the world. They have an army of rainbow colored lizard folk somewhere out there that they converted to the power of makeup and the power of improvised dance. Right below the cleric, we have the druid. The druid and the cleric have a lot of similarities. So, they're similarly wisdom based, but the druid's big thing is they live among nature and can turn into animals. They don't quite usually get as heavy as armor as the clerics, but they're able to run, hide, and they're still as good at the perceiving, the insight, and things along those natures. If you're lost in the woods, a druid can probably find their way home. Next on this list is the fighter. And at this point, the fighter is, as the name implies, they fight things. They're a very flexible class. You can make an archer here, you can make a swordsman, you can make a person who runs around with a giant hammer, and they're probably the simplest class to be in the game, and the one I most recommend for new players. But your fighter can be a tactician, a soldier, a gladiator, or they can be an archer hiding in a treetop. It's a very flexible class and very easy to learn. So it lets you kind of, like a lot of fighters end up being a sort of group leader because they have less they have to do on their own. There's more they can do to help out other people. Next up is the monk. The monk punches people. They're all about dexterity and wisdom. Pick your anime character, they're probably a monk. They're the ones at higher levels who can punch you and make you explode, fire energy blasts from their hands. They're definitely the do you want to be an anime character class. To try and round out this list, Paladins are very charismatic fighters with some healer powers. They're like right in the middle between a fighter and a cleric. Ranger is a fighter who lives in the woods that gets some magic. Rogues are exactly what you would think they would be, highly dexterous, good at hiding. They do extra damage when they hit somebody from the shadows. And they're the sneakiest class. They're good at picking locks and picking pockets. Everyone from Batman to Han Solo is probably a rogue. Sorcerers are kind of a weird one. I don't really recommend them for new players. They're charisma based magic users who were born with some kind of unique power from either their bloodline or their origins. And they're just a very complex spell focused class. The Warlock is very similar to the Sorcerer in some ways, but they got their power from making a contract with something or someone. Warlocks maybe made a deal with a demon to avenge your fallen parents. Maybe you made a deal with a trickster fairy and didn't quite know what you got into. And the last class on our list is Wizard. Wizards are the only really intelligence based class, and their powers come from studying books, learning magic, writing down spells, and they're what you would immediately picture for a wizard. You can go full pointy hat and just make the most typical Harry Potter character you can imagine, or you can go a little more nuanced with them. Maybe you're a pyrotechnical specialist, what have you. But for the sake of our first games and early sessions, and say we want to play next week and you've been following along clicking boxes, I recommend that you only pick from fighter, cleric, rogue, or wizard to start. Maybe bard. A lot of these classes are more complex and are almost worth looking into when you make further characters are more used to the game. But your basic core team, and your basic 5-person party will often have a wizard, a rogue, some kind of fighter, and some kind of cleric or druid. And with that explained, I'm going to pick a fighter for our create a character. So now that we picked our fighter, we start going into a bit of the nitty gritty. So first, each class gets its own hit points. This may look complicated, but effectively it reads, each time you level up, you get 6 hit points plus whatever your constitution stat is. So for a fighter, you're getting a decent amount per level, but a wizard would be getting 2 or 3 less hit points per level. Your hit points are when they hit 0, you hit the ground, and you start dying. And if your friends don't save you, it could get real bad really fast. Next, we get into proficiencies. Oh, of course, feel free to grab your food and send me a message when you return. Is everyone still following along? Because this is a lot, and I understand that. Feel free to give me a thumbs up if I should keep going. Excellent. All right, I'm going to keep going. So, proficiencies. To give a quick summary. So, at the end of this lecture, one of the bonus prize I'm going to give you guys for coming through here is anyone who joins one of the campaigns I create on D&D Beyond will have access to all of my books. So if I'm running a campaign, all up to 8 players who are in that campaign will have digital access to all of my books. So I can definitely give you access to a Kenku if you're committed to that. And to those who do not know what a Kenku is a fascinating crow humanoid that can only speak in mimicry and are pretty much the most goth thing to ever goth, and I love them. I typically will use a Kenku in almost every campaign I run, for the sake of letting me throw movie quotes in at random, and they just make me happy. Alright, to get back to the topic at hand for this one, proficiencies are things your character are good at that use a skill and get something called a proficiency bonus. So say you have a strength score of 5, where you add 5 to all your strength checks with a dice roll. And to explain for D&D, most things in the game use what are called skill checks, where you roll a 20-sided dice, and you add the numbers that apply to that roll to see whether you succeed or fail. All mechanics in the game, from hiding to attacking, use some variation of that system. What being proficient in something means is you get to add first the stat that applies, then you get to add something called a proficiency bonus, which goes up as your character levels. So say my fighter wants to push someone into the ground. My fighter has a strength of 10. That means I don't add or minus anything from the roll. If I want to shove someone, it will use athletics. Because I'm now proficient in athletics, I get to add my proficiency bonus to that roll, which starts as a 2. I apologize for mathing at people, but the digital character sheet will do most of the math for you when you're actually playing. But this just could be some useful information. So if my fighter is planning to shove a bunch of people, I decide that I'm pretty much going to make a boxer. I will intentionally build him so strength is his highest stat. Just move these numbers around a bit. And then I'm going to make him a proficient in athletics so I can push people over. Next thing I'm going to pick is I think I'm going to make him intimidating as well. So that way, as my character, if I'm making my generic moody anime boy with a giant sword, I want to be able to push people, and I want to be able to be scary with just... That's how I want to do it. And then for a fighter, and a lot of classes, all classes will have you pick a couple proficiencies, and different classes will have different decisions you make at level 1. For the fighter, you get to pick a fighting style. This may seem like a pretty extensive list, but the long and short of it is each one you pick will give you some idea. Like if I'm an archer, it makes me better at archery. But I think I'm going to build giant sword anime boy. So I'm going to pick an ability that makes me do more damage when I swing with a giant sword. So now that I've made my choices on this sheet, I'm going to move. to my numbers, and I'm like, okay, I'm probably going to give them heavier armor, and I'm liking how my numbers look, where the biggest stat he is strong. Then his next best stat is being fast. He can take a punch. He's kind of intelligent, some book learning, but he's very oblivious. But he's a somewhat good talker. So, one thing I like to do for building characters is I always try and give them a low stat, because that helps with the acting of the character. So, for example, spiky haired anime boy that I'm making right now, he is oblivious. He won't be able to tell how people think or feel. He'll get ambushed often. And that way I have a flaw. So that lets me as a player run into the action, because that's the way I want to play this game. And as I'm running into the action, I'm not going to notice traps. I'm not going to get a good read on whether or not I'm being tricked. And yes, there is some workarounds for recreating and homebrewing and things. But for the sake of this, and as I mentioned before, I'm explaining how to make Adventure League legal characters, as it were, because these are characters you could use anywhere. But there is definitely workarounds for the poor student to make everything work. There's always a trick and a workaround, because D&D players have found many ways to acquire this information without paying the company money. But I digress. So, now that I've done the class and the abilities, the meaty-greedy of how your character plays, and when you're making your own characters, you can always send me a message for if you're trying to figure out your class, trying to figure out your stats, and I'm always happy to help with that information. But now, for the writing community, we get into the meat and potatoes of the character, the description and background. So, first, they have a bunch of pre-done up backgrounds that give you a very rough outline of your backstory and give you a non-combat power of sorts. Like, for example, if you pick Alkalite here, it makes you better at insight, reading people, religion, knowing religion, and some point in your background you started working at a temple. And that just gives you a very, very rough outline to help you flesh out your own character so you don't have to come up with something from scratch. If you're super committed to a backstory you've already read, you could go custom background and then you would choose a couple skills, an ability, and things like that. But that's the kind of thing that works best if you work with your dungeon master to help him to work with him to create. For something that you just want to play and drop in a game, picking one of these outlines out of these shells to start and filling it in is a good way to go. So since I picked spiky hair anime guy, I'm going to pick haunted one. Something so terrible he doesn't speak of. He tried to bury it and run away with it. From no avail, it haunts him in his nightmares. And it gives a very brief overview. As part of that backstory, he's good at survival, which makes him good at finding food in the wilderness, running and hiding from things. And I'm going to give him some knowledge of religion. Next, you pick a couple languages. For languages, it really depends on what your dungeon master's running in the campaign or adventure. I have one friend who always picks Draconic because the odds that they'll run into a dragon in a game called Dungeons and Dragons is pretty high. But part of this is making your own character as well, of did they grow up in a bilingual community? Were they raised among elves? In the case of spiky-haired anime boy, some villain destroyed his hometown, and in his research, he's learned how to speak Abyssal, a language of evil. So, part of each background gives you a little feature. Like this one, commoners will be nice to you because you look like you've seen some things, and it goes into his edgy persona. These don't come up often, but when you do, you remind your dungeon master of these things. It gives you more things to do in the role-playing aspects of the game. So when you go to a town and go to talk to somebody, that's when this kind of thing will come in handy. Next, we get to personality traits, and this is part of how to build a character. These, like most things while making a character, are more guideline than facts. If you just want to throw a character together quickly, you can just pick some personality traits from these lists. And these personality traits are typically things that are really easy to act, easy to play at the table, and if you want to adjust them a little bit, they're not much issue. For example, if I'm building spiky-haired anime boy here, I'll give him the I don't talk about the darkness that torments me, and I live for the thrill of the hunt. So when playing with my party and other players, say another player decide to be the group mom cleric, I'm the edgy character who wants to run in, and for our banter between us, as I explain how I need to run in and fight the evil villain, it'll be the higher wisdom party members who will tell me to calm down, think things through, come up with a plan. Next on the list is your ideal. It's kind of your character's motivation and what helped them become an adventurer. Because emotionally stable, well adjusted people don't go together and hunt in groups. You usually have some kind of guiding principle that led you to this lifestyle. And when you're making a character for this game, always ask yourself, how come this character is an adventurer? Because the last thing you want while trying to play this game together with your friends is to give the, well, my character wouldn't come along and play the game. You want to make a character that wants to be an adventurer, wants to play Dungeons and Dragons. So you don't end up getting caught in your own acting and lose focus of the fact that you are still playing a game with your friends. So for this character, I'm going to give him a dark calling to hunt down evil that puts him above the law. And he's a monster that destroys other monsters. So edgy, so extra. Next up is Bonds. Bonds is a fun one. It typically is the section where you kind of give yourself who do you care about. And a lot of these bonds work really well if you talk with your other players and kind of make them tie into their stories as well. Like, say, for example, our group is spiky haired anime boy and medical flower girl who sells flowers on the street and became a cleric. My character's backstory is my torment drove away the person I care about. And then their backstory might be their brother died in a war. So you can kind of give them like a bit of work together to figure out why these characters are traveling together and what makes them a team. And lastly is the character flaw. The character flaw not only gives you something to play up and act up so you can have some issues to create conflict and interesting narrative choices, but they give the dungeon master something to play with to mess with. As a general rule, a good dungeon master will see what your character's flaws are, taunt you with them, and then reward you for overcoming them. Like, say, for example, your character sees the worst in people. As a dungeon master, I'll know this, and I'll make it that a character that seems sketchy is actually a really good person. And if you learn to give them a chance, they might help you later in the dungeon. So, for these next boxes, these are all of your many, many character details that you can just kind of fill out in your own time. There's your alignment. Are you good? Are you evil? Are you neutral? For your first character, never make an evil character. It just doesn't end well for anybody. You're most likely to be lawful good. You follow the rules, you help each other, heart of the cards, all that fun stuff. Or chaotic good. Your Han Solos has a heart of gold, kind of sketchy. Or your various forms of neutral. It might be fun if you played this game a lot to try out an evil character, but it's just easier not to bother. Next is lifestyle, how broke you are. It's not really worth going into unless you're running one of the longer lasting campaigns. So you don't have to put too much fire into that, but it really comes down to, did you used to be rich and do you spend all your money with your keeping up your expensive lifestyle? Or are you from the streets trying to make ends meet? We got our fun boxes of physical characteristics, age, height, weight, gender, non-binary, all that fun stuff. And then we have some notes. And these are more likely to be things you fill in as the game goes. But for the section labeled backstory, you don't want to give your dungeon master entire essays and full turn papers. I find you want to cap it no longer than 1,000-word short story. A nice 500-word backstory will give you something to pull into and reach from when you're in role-playing moments, without bogging you too down on the specifics, and trying to keep everyone around the same field. The average dungeon master is not going to be upset if you give them a nice, solid, one sheet of paper backstory. If you give them 10 pages, it might be a little much. But I've also played where people haven't even filled in that box and just made it up and wrote it down as they went along. And that's completely fine. One of my players, for example, made a character who, pronounced to them, was a giant that was raised among the dwarves, and he effectively went through the plot of Elf, filling in the notes as he went along. And if you have trust with your dungeon master and have him work back and forth with you, and you say, oh yes, I've been here before, your dungeon master will likely accept that as true and then work that into the story and tie it in with the back and forth between you. So once we finished your backstory, we got your stats, we picked a class, we picked a race. Next is your equipment. We're going to keep this real simple. You choose starting equipment. It'll give you a couple prompts. Light armor or heavy armor? I'm going to go heavy armor. A martial weapon and a shield. So a martial weapon is a weapon that requires more finesse than just a stick or a hammer. Since I've already decided that I'm making edgy anime boy, he needs to have a sword taller than he is. Gets a free crossbow, gets an explorer pack, which has a bunch of generic venturing supplies. As a general rule, once you've picked your starting equipment that the sheet just gives you or the player textbook gives you, you'll then be in between turns looking on your seat, and it won't be immediately apparent that you need a crowbar, or you need some climbing pythons, or you need a tinderbox, but at some point you'll have a beautiful moment. And I've seen all my players have these beautiful moments where they're looking in their inventory, they have a eureka inspiration, and they do something truly inspired you could never manage in a more conventional game. They'll do something like, oh, this dragon's going to fly away. Let's nail down these ropes using our climbing kit and tie them to the ground. Or they'll be like, are these rations flammable? I'm going to put them in a pile with all my tinder, light this on fire, and try and smoke them out. Or, in the case of one particularly ambitious group of players, they're going to use the gear in their backpack to stage this area to look like a cult happened here to pass off their crimes as somebody else. Then, your backstory that you picked earlier comes with a couple of free things you get based on the backstory, and we're just going to add your starting equipment. And then, you're not going to actually have to worry about your equipment until you get into the game proper, because all your in-game shopping and acquiring gear is more likely to happen when the game's going. So to give a quick recap, you start with a race, and as a general rule, leaning into your tropes, knowing what you imagine to be an elf or a dwarf or a goblin makes it easy to kind of give you a framework of what you want to play. But there is no shame in just playing a human, since that's easy, natural, no issue at all. Next, you pick your class. Each class is typically good at 2 stats. Like your fighter is a strength and dexterity class, your barbarian is a strength and constitution class, and you could spend days reading every class looking at all its powers and what it does. But when you're just starting at your game, your best bet is to try and describe how you want to play and let your DM or me help you be guided to the class you want to be. If you pick a fictional character that already exists, which is something I'll recommend to a lot of new players, is choosing like a template character. Like, I want to be Aang from Avatar The Last Airbender. I would lead you to Monk. I would help you with your basic selections, and then from there you can customize and change them. Because through the course of the game, and through any improvisational exercise, what you start with will never be who you end up with, and your own personality will always leak into the character to create something original. So there's no shame in just trying to make a character you know you understand, and then customizing them to be original. But if you've already written a 15-page backstory for your awesome druid, werewolf, ninja, I will do everything in my power to work with you to make that character. And the game has enough freedom and creativity that you'll be able to do it with just the free rules provided. There's enough control it gives you that you can make this happen without having to spend extra money, write custom rules. And odds are what you're the idea you'll work on is doable. So after you picked your race, class, and stats, and I never pick, I work on them in sequence. Sometimes I'll pick the class first, and then I'll go for race and abilities based on it. Sometimes I'll pick the stats first, and then go with the class and the race. And by picking the stats, if your strength, you have the good idea that you're a character who's running in and hitting things. If your dexterity, you're a character who's sitting back, sneaking up, taking shots. If your intelligence, you're a character that is doing research. You're telling your team, oh, this is weak to this. This is immune to this. This trap is magical. This is probably cursed. And you're giving your fun facts to your team. And because it's a role playing game, you, the player, if you're playing an intelligent character, don't have to be intelligent. Just tell me the kind of information you want or your dungeon master, and they'll have you typically roll a dice and give you 2 to 3 pieces of information based on how you do. Like, say you're like, what do I know about dragons? And I say, okay, make an arcana check. You would roll your 20-sided dice, add your intelligence booster to it, add your proficiency to it, and say it adds up to a 20. It'd be like, red dragons are immune to fire. They move like about 60 feet. They have incredibly tough skin. They can be bribed by shiny rocks. Next up is your wisdom character. They're the ones who will fix your broken bone. They'll be like, we're being watched. Something seems off. The ground doesn't look right. There might be a pitfall trap ahead. And they're really good at searching, being situation aware, or knowing, or the classic, is this person lying to us? I don't trust them. And lastly, charisma is interacting with characters. One of the best parts of Dungeons and Dragons is because your dungeon master is a person you're interacting with. Every villager, every shopkeeper, every goblin is a character, and you can interact with them. I've had parties be the first goblin they ever saw, they knocked unconscious, tied up with a rope, befriended, chatted with, bribed, and he's now the mayor of a thriving town. Your charisma characters are the best at convincing somebody to do something, but it was a team effort. The wisdom character was able to figure out what the goblin wanted. The charisma character was able to convince them to work towards the goals. And the intelligence character was able to piece together the riddle they needed. And this ends with them recruiting a group of bandits and having them open their own First National Bank. Because when you all pull in with your unique skills, that's what brings some interesting dynamics to the game. So when you're picking your stats, you might be picking for yourself, but I like to hold group character creation sessions so you can try and figure out what each other are lacking so you can work together. But I've also ran a game where they had 4 rogues and all of them were assassins, and they had similar skill sets, and we ran a fantastic Ocean 11 style heist before. So once you got your race, your class, your abilities, your description, you get to choose your starting equipment, and then we go to what's next. So you can either view your sheet online, or you can get yourself a PDF printed off, get yourself some clanky math rocks, and sit at a table. So I'm going to click View Character Sheet here, give another walkthrough now that we built our character, so I can tell you what you're looking at. First, the row of numbers at the top of it are your basic stats. If you're just doing a thing and you don't have an appropriate skill, you can use a stat. I have it set up so you can literally click right on the sheet, click the button, it will roll the math rock for you, it'll tell you the score. Below those, we have what are called saving throws. Each class is good at 2 saving throws, and they're kind of your reaction to something bad happening. Like, say an enemy casts a fireball at you, and it tells you to make a dexterity saving throw. Your saving throw is whatever number you have in your stat box, and if you're proficient in it, it'll have a little dot next to it and give you a little bonus. As a fighter, I'm proficient at strength. It's really hard to knock me over. And I'm proficient in constitution. It's really hard to poison me. But my character's terrible at wisdom. So if someone uses hypnosis magic on me, I'm going to be pretty weak to that. But I could still get a rookie roll and get out of there. Right here is your proficiency bonus. It works out to being roughly half your level rounded down. But by using the online sheet, it'll just tell you when the number goes up, and you can expect that. Right here, we have an inspiration box. How inspiration works, if you do something fun in the narrative, a cool story moment, something like, a good example would be when the Cleric of Beauty I mentioned before successfully converted a villain to stop being evil by giving them a makeover and helping them feel better about themselves. I, as the dungeon master, say, I'm awarding you an inspiration. You click the box and it'll let you re-roll 1 dice as a reward for doing exceptional storytelling. Next on our sheet, we have your armor class. That number is how high something has to roll to hit you. By putting on armor, which I will do right now, the number will go up. For the specifics, most classes will give you appropriate armor to start with, and it can get a little daunting, but as a general rule, lighter armor isn't as good at giving you an armor class, but heavy armor will make you worse at stealth. So I'm going to give you your starting chainmail here. So to hit somebody, they have to roll a d20, add their stat that they're hitting them with, which would be like their strength, add their proficiency, and if they hit that number, you'll take damage. So now that we've went through those ones, next on the sheet, we have these passive scores. Long story short, they're the numbers DMs will calculate to just see if you casually notice things. Below that, we got another little proficiency box. This tells you that as a fighter, you're good with all kinds of armor. You're good at using martial weapons, simple weapons. If you say we're good in your backstory at using thieves' tools or poisons, they would go in this box. And here's the languages you speak. Next on our list, we have your skills. So when you try and do something in D&D, and you're trying to improvise and do something cool, you describe what you're going to do, and then the dungeon master will tell you which skill to roll. So say you do the classic solid snake, I want to hide in a box. I will say roll a stealth check. So you're not proficient in stealth, you're kind of dexterous, you'll just roll a d20, add 2 to it, you got a 22. You're extremely well hidden. So the enemy would try and find you by rolling a perception check to see if they can see you. They did not do as well. They got an 8. You're still hidden until you do something to reveal your location. A lot of D&D is skills, and a lot of it is the casual barter between you and the dungeon master. So say, for example, and this is how I run the games, and various dungeon masters may differ, but I like to give players hints and give them a pretty good idea how difficult something would be. So say you want to lift a boulder, and it's just a boulder the size of you. I'll say, it'll take a 15 strength check to do it. And you'll say, I'm proficient with athletics. Can I use athletics to lift a rock? I'll say yes. So how it goes is a DC 15, which is dice check, would be like, oh, it's something light. Now, if you tell me I want to lift a giant granite slab the size of me, I'll say that'll be extremely difficult. And if I say extremely difficult, you'll probably feel like you'll need like a 20 or a 25 to beat that. You never know for sure, but you kind of start to get the feeling of it. So, to lift something like that, you would have to roll extremely high. And a lot of it is you have to trust your dungeon master to kind of figure out how difficult something would be when you're improvising actions. And that makes up doing a lot of things in Dungeons and Dragons. But if you don't want to improvise things and you want to use the powers written on your sheet, we'll go to our actions here. So as a fighter, at level 1, you get to make 1 attack a round when you're in combat. So how a combat would play out is, say you're doing social situations, you're talking to a bunch of villagers, and then one of your party members is like, I'm just going to slap this gangster. I will say, it is now combat. Everyone roll initiative. Initiative is a number everybody rolls, and I write down to figure out the order of things happening. Now that we're in a combat scenario, you can still improvise, but now everyone is expected to have turns. In your turn, you're considered to have 6 seconds of cinematic time. It's enough time to have a quick conversation and to take an action and a bonus action. Each turn, you can move, and your movement speed will be based on your character, but most move about 30 feet around. If we're playing on a grid, I will set up a grid. Each square will be worth 5 feet. You will literally count 30 and move. If we're playing Theater of the Mind, I'll typically tell you if something's close, nearby, or far, or you'll ask, can I get to them in a turn? So once you've moved your 30 feet and ran up to, say, this gangster with your giant sword, you'll use your action to make an attack. Attacking is 2 steps. First, you roll a d20, 20-sided dice, and then you add any applicable bonus. So for a greatsword, you would add your strength, because it's a strength-based weapon. and you would add your proficiency because you are proficient in martial weapons. You got a 24. I would then look at the character sheet and see if that number is higher than its arbor class. It is. I will say your attack hits. Next, you get to roll damage. Damage is where all the different fun color, fun size dice are. In the case of a greatsword, it'll say right on the sword, 2d6 plus 3. So you would roll two six-sided dice, and then you would add your strength modifier, which is the plus 3. So you hit this goblin for 14 damage. As you can tell looking at your own level 1 sheet, you only have 12 hit points. Running up to this goblin and hitting it with a giant sword has killed this goblin. If you decide, oh, I don't want to kill the goblin, I just want to knock it unconscious, you can say, I want to knock the goblin unconscious. It would work the same way. You have just let the dungeon master know your intention. So, for that turn to play out, I'll be like, I run up to the goblin. I draw forth my giant novelty anime sword, twice the length of my body. I bring it down with a mighty swing. And then, once you do that, the dungeon master would proceed to go, your attack hits, roll damage. 14. As the mighty blade clives into his clavicle and cuts clean through the goblin, you have ended his life. At that point, you might go, no, I meant to say I knocked unconscious. But okay, next time, give me a heads up in advance. But this time, you use the flat of your blade. It donks on his head with the mighty shockwaves of a frying pan, and he is crumpled, out cold at your feet. The next thing you get in your turn is a bonus action. Bonus actions are special powers that different classes get. You don't always get a bonus action. Not all classes have a bonus action. As a fighter, the only bonus action you have is a couple times a day, you can heal yourself for a little bit. So if you took some damage, like I'm going to use my bonus action to second wind, and it lets you roll a dice and heal back some hit points. If you're a rogue, they'll have like, oh, as a bonus action, I can hide. So you'll run up, attack, find a bush, and then hide in it. So other than using your weapons, your actions are you can attack, you can cast a spell, you can dash, which just has you have you double your movement speed that turn. You can disengage, which I will explain in a moment. You can grapple somebody, you can help out a friend, you can hide. But a lot of these things are you can pretty much do anything because it's such an improvised friendly game. This list of actions is more of a list of suggestions, really. But you do only get one a turn when you're in combat. For bonus actions, your DM is going to give you far less freedom with them because they're often specific class powers you get. And a bonus action is something that usually happens so fast that you won't really get to improvise something in a bonus action. The last thing you get on your turn is a reaction. What a reaction is you get one reaction is things you can do during other people's turns if the right criteria happens. One free reaction every character gets is called an attack of opportunity. If someone within 5 feet of you moves away, you can use your reaction to swing at them and effectively cheap shot them as they're running away. In the earlier list, I gave disengage as one of your actions, which lets you make it so someone can't do this opportunity attack against you. Some classes will get reactions like take less damage or cancel a spell, and it's really on a class by class basis. So, now that I've covered combat, role playing, and actions, one of the big things you can do is cast spells, but for this character and this lecture, I'm not really going to go super in depth in spell casting. It effectively comes down to read the spell, see which stats it uses, and it's a thing I can cover on a more personal player-to-player basis. But the last thing I'm going to cover in today's lecture is leveling up. So there's two ways leveling up happens in D&D. First, your dungeon master tracks experience for everything you do, and will just let you know when you've gained enough experience points to level, like a traditional video game. The second method, the one I use, is the Milestone Method, where I level you guys up based on preset milestones when I think your character has overcome enough small challenges or a big enough big challenge to gain level. In Dungeons & Dragons, the game technically goes from level 1 to 20, but I've never had a campaign last long enough to go all the way up. It takes a very long time with the rules as written to hit maximum level in D&D. The closest I've gotten is to level 19, and then the pandemic happened. But early levels go much faster. So, you've defeated your goblins, you've rescued this city, you've befriended some of them, and they now work for you running a small bar. I, as a dungeon master, are happy with your achievements, so I'm going to let everybody level up to level 2. To level up, you click the gearbox on the previous sheet and it'll bring you back to your character builder from before. You'll put the level to level 2, and then it will tell you what ability you get at level 2. In the case of a fighter, once a day, they can take 2 actions, which is a pretty fantastic power. Then, I'm going to level this fighter all the way up to level 3. So once you level up, all you get is the abilities it says, and then your hit points will go up accordingly. Some dungeon masters use a mechanic where you roll dice to see how many more hit points you get. I just use the average. It feels bad to roll bad, so I just typically use average numbers. So, the last thing worth a little bit of explaining is every class in the game gets a subclass at either level 1, 2, or 3. And it's kind of like your specialization. Because I have a whole bunch of options on account of buying all of the books, there is a ton of options. For the basic rules, most classes will get 2 or 3. So, for a fighter, the main choice you'll get is, do you want to be a champion? A champion is a fighter who's particularly good at being a fighter. They want you more fighter, and you're a fighter, you're a champion. The other starting one they give you is a battle master. A battle master gives you proficiency with a toolkit. They give you special maneuvers you can use a certain number of kinds a day. And there's no real easy way for me to go over every class and every subclass, because that lecture would take a long time. But what I recommend is just taking your time, especially if you're building with the free rules, to look at the 2 or 3 options it gives you. I honestly don't recommend anything other than the basic rules for making your first character, because this game has so many options. You don't want to give yourself choice paralysis, and you don't want to give yourself more abilities than you know how to use. Starting low, picking things that seem less complicated, choosing starting subclasses is a way to make the game easier for yourself. Because the less you have to focus on, the more you can focus on the role-playing aspects of the game. So, with that, we've went through the basis of what your components are on your character sheet, what all the different dice rolls are, what proficiency and skills mean, what your 6 stats are, what they represent, how to make a character, how combat works. On the sheet, we've went through your actions, we've went through leveling up briefly. Your inventory will tell you what things do. You can click on items, they'll give you a nice little in-depth description, but as a general rule, you can do more in this game than what's written. Like, for example, you start with a set of handcuffs. It'll say right on the handcuffs how hard it is to break out of, but that won't stop you from throwing them like a boomerang at your enemy. Or putting a bunch of them together to build yourself an elaborate rope bridge, or wearing it as a fashionable belt. Once we get past items, this next tab, features and traits, just lights down all the powers your class gives you. Here's where it tells you about the fighting style we picked earlier, lists your proficiencies, tells you about your second wind ability, and as your character levels up, there'll be more and more things. At the bottom, it goes into various powers your race gives you, your languages. On our next tab, we have the backstory fun stuff we established earlier. There's a tab for just filling in extra notes, whatever you think is worth writing down. And with that, I think that covers my basic lecture. I will now turn to chat for any questions or comments you guys have. All right. Looking at a lot of silence here. So I'm just going to assume I did a perfect job and everyone understands this game perfectly now. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. I'm going to be stopping this recording shortly. And I will be putting this whole thing up on YouTube with a link if anyone would like to rewatch some sections, share with their friends. Last chance for any questions or comments. Much obliged. Oh, of course. What do you got for me? They do not at all. That is a very good question. So, as I mentioned before, building a party requires different sets of skills and different mixtures. So, say for example, your character you want to build is, I'm going to say, you're a wandering musician and your entire objective in life is to play a sold out Super Bowl show on your guitar. And you're just making this musician. You can choose spells that support your friends. You can choose skills and performance and conversation. There have been entire sessions I've ran of D&D where I've planned a fight and my players never actually got to a fight or got to the comment because they negotiated, they diplomacied, they talked their way through it. So if you wanted to build a character that's goal was support, you could choose a bard who has a bonus action, gives people extra dice they can roll to combine with their skills. You can build a medic to help each other out. You can build a character with spells that make them better at talking, smoother dialogue. You can build a character who reads people emotionally, whose objective is to work things out through peace. I have seen in my years running this game so many sliver solutions, so many problems. There's one time where instead of fighting a dragon, they fed him, gave him massages, became his friend, wrote a 5-point economic plan as to why it was more profitable for him to charge taxes to protect a town than to pillage. And the dragon is now mayor of that town. So you can definitely build characters. I have built a character that I've played myself that didn't have a single attack. They only had ways to annoy, things that were amusing, and support skills. Because that's the character I wanted to build. But that's a great conversation to have with your group while you're building your characters. Because you will want, some people in your party will naturally want to fight more. And they're going to build a fighter or a barbarian or even a wizard. But they're going to tell you that they like to fight. And if your character likes to dialogue, likes to romance, likes to be the group scenographer, as long as you're clear with your party and with your dungeon master at the start of the game, the kind of character you want to play, and the group understands, and everyone goes into it with this mutual understanding, you can make anything. I hope that answered your question. If you like, I can almost number the classes based on how combat focused versus roleplay focused they are.
Oh, a combat class can be roleplay as well.
Oh, absolutely. Like, the combat system is in effect for people who enjoy the turn-based tactical combat, but it's definitely not the only solution to problems. And when I run my own games, I don't typically have more than a third of the game session be fighting. There was typically one fight a session. That's just simply a ratio I find that works. Because a lot of, like I said, the 3 pillars: role-playing, exploration, and combat, and I try and keep my games balanced among the 3. Do we have any other questions? Oh, my pleasure. All right. With that, I'm going to end this recording, process it to throw it up on the internet, and anyone who's attended at any point can always direct message me with more questions or concerns. And I have a pretty good idea about the first game I'm going to run. I'm going to post something probably later today or early tomorrow about when I would like to start sign-up sheets for games. And I'm thinking about running a series of loosely connected games where you can keep your character, keep your progress, but it's very much drop in and out, so you don't have to commit to doing a weekly thing. It's a project I've been working on with a friend of mine for a while now. So, with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. Have yourselves a lovely Monday. Take care. And I am up far too early tomorrow. Bye.